dead. Art is dead. Art is dead.
So, while researching my Obi-Wan Kenobi video, I stumbled across a very interesting interview with George Lucas where he discussed Hollywood back in the day when the first Star Wars was released. He talked about his initial concerns about quote-unquote industry taking the power over the very newborn franchise away from him. But this narrative that even back then the filmmakers were scared of the industry corrupting their art is quite intriguing because it tones down the idea of Disney as the corrupter of cinema, as we all like to refer to it as. But before we go on, you know what Disney loves more than money? Making it by doing almost nothing, and with the help of today's sponsor, Honeygain, you can be the same way too. And the only thing you need is to download Honeygain and you're all set to earn passive income only by running the app in the background. Of course, this will not make you rich enough to purchase Disney, but it will make you rich enough to purchase Disney Plus, monthly subscriptions, maybe Hulu or Netflix, Amazon Prime if you wish. How this works is that once Honeygain is active on your device, the app will securely share your internet connection. It will gather bits of information to help out companies. This is completely safe since Honeygain does not ask for access to the device's storage or other sensitive data. Click the link in the description using my promo code Nutsa to download Honeygain and get your first $5 only for signing up. Since yes, even back in the 70s, film industry was still pretty much a money-oriented, monopolist enterprise that was at odds with any artistry or creativity. But nevertheless, back then with much less leeway in terms of technology, we got some of the biggest and most groundbreaking franchises in history of cinema despite the industry. While now we get an occasional cookie-cutter but good Marvel movie, maybe one or two half-decent remakes, and not even that anymore. So where did it go wrong?
Some people are white guys in 1985.
White guys in 1985.
Surprisingly, there was a moment in time when making giant blockbusters was frowned upon in Hollywood and was considered unprofitable, hence in some ancient times, Hollywood preferred to make and invest in the movies that today you would only see as indies. Lucas respectfully refers to those movies as street movies as opposed to giant epics, psychological dramas, and films much more oriented on good and solid stories than breaking the grounds of cinema. Creating epic movies back in the day was not only a huge risk, but needed a lot of money, since it required physical sets and people because of the non-existent technology. And if we know one thing about Hollywood, they do love their money. So because there was no way to lure the audiences into theaters with pretty spectacles or CGI fight scenes or big war sequences, that left Hollywood with one choice and one choice only: the story. You know, characters, the boring stuff. And to them, writing solid quote-unquote boring films about human experience that did not require a lot from the hair and makeup team was not only cheap, but the safest option. And because the film market only ever consisted of those types of films, people didn't ask or expect anything from industry other than a good story. It's funny looking back today that filmmakers like Lucas, Cameron, Spielberg, etc. looked at filmmaking at the time and thought, I hate this is stupid, there's gonna be another way, found another way, and that led to today where films are at the exact same point of, I hate this is stupid, there's gonna be another way, in a completely opposite circumstances. The lack of creativity those filmmakers criticized at the time did not refer to the stories, but to the lack of cinematic epicness when it comes to telling those stories. Now, the absence of epic blockbuster-looking films is not an issue anymore. It's the story that we lack this time. But they were right in the assumption that cinema could do much more, go much bigger, and that the old traditional ways of filmmaking were getting dated as the technologies progressed. But their intention was never to get the spotlight off of the stories in order to get there. Quite the opposite. They wanted to enhance digital effects so that could give them ability to tell their stories better. The stories were never meant to take the back seat. It's just something that unfortunately happened on its own. It was just a matter of time until Hollywood realized that it was enough for a movie to feel, look, and sound like art rather than actually being it to make enough profit. It's not that industry has changed. They still want a cheaper way. They still don't care about artistry, but what is cheap has changed, therefore what industry values has changed drastically. And I would say this makes companies like Disney a product of their time. It's just that this one mousy, big-eared enterprise realized it first and utilized it the best. As technologies progressed, the shift from purely story-oriented casual films to purely spectacle-based blockbusters was not sudden and didn't happen overnight, which caused that very rare moment in history where we got films that were more or less hybrids of both. The moment in time where new doe-eyed filmmakers were experimenting with newfound digital ways while also maintaining the grace of the past cinema in regards to their scripts. And that created a short-lived era of Star Wars, Terminator, Alien, Jurassic Park, Blade Runner, even Disney animated movies, etc. You know, all the stuff that Hollywood is feeding off of today. But once the industry realized that grand scores, cinematography, and digital CGI worlds could pretty much create an illusion of great storytelling, they stopped prioritizing stories because easy. Therefore, listening to George Lucas express his initial infatuation with epics and how technologies are gonna pave the way for the better ways for storytelling is like hearing Qui-Gon Jinn gush about young Anakin for the first time. Yes, that kid is gonna be great someday, but not in a way you probably imagine.
Living in the future. Living in the future. I'm living in the future. I'm living in the future.
Visual effects, the thing that once represented the peak of innovative artistry and greater future of cinema. The very first utilizations of VFX and CGI were always about finding new ways to experiment with the art of cinema, push boundaries, enhance possibilities, make the unreal happen. But no matter what, digital effects were always meant to help to tell the stories. And it's easy today to undermine just how much the implementation of technologies meant back then. For the first time in history, the humanity was given an opportunity to witness something so fantastical with our own two eyes that before was only attainable either in the world of written fiction, in our fantasies, or maybe our dreams. While before the filmmakers were tied to the ground, the digital ways gave them ability to let go, fly, travel the galaxies, travel in time, build entire worlds, and break those worlds. But the tragedy of the situation is in the fact that today the industry, and for the most part even the audience, cannot differentiate between an artist using technology to breathe life into their world building and a filmmaker overusing VFX and CGI as a substitute for one. CGI and VFX artists are meant to make the fictional worlds possible, but they cannot replace the storyteller. Digital effects is a storytelling technique. Techniques cannot tell stories. Filmmakers back then could never predict that one day we would have an abundance of technologies enough to create entire universes in a blink of an eye, but most of those worlds would be soulless, static, and lifeless as a consequence of constant and unending misuse and abuse of both CGI and artists who worked on it. Technologies have never stopped progressing, but the way they are utilized in film has been stale for years now, because the computer-generated effects and imagery that were invented to allow more creative ways of storytelling now are just only ever looked at as a cheaper way of making films as opposed to creative, groundbreaking purposes. The saddest part of all this is that it's not like the industry stopped favoring stories to put all their money and attention to VFX and CGI. No, in reality, computer-generated imagery is just as neglected and uncared for as every aspect of film. The fact that technologies are used more than ever in film does not mean that they are used correctly, creatively, or artistically. Yes, CGI is overused by Hollywood, but it's also underutilized. It's heartbreaking to hear people blame technologies for ruining cinema, since if used correctly, technologies have broken and will continue to break the grounds of what a movie can achieve. Invention, existence, or usage of CGI hasn't damaged the movie industry. It's abuse of it that did. And now we get movies and shows that look worse than they have ever looked before, made by technology that was invented to enhance cinematography. We get movies and shows with non-existent direction, made by tech that was made to enhance options for filmmakers.
Everything all of the time.
Today, with social media, companies' approach to marketing of movies has completely changed, surprisingly. Back in the day, the ways to guarantee that the movie would sell well were not many. One of the most trusted tactics, I would be guessing, was to, good old try of make it good, so whoever watched it would go back home and spread the word to their friends and family. Cool-looking trailers, Twitter advocates, Rotten Tomato scores, 500 gazillion interviews on YouTube, and the cast's social media presence was not a thing then. Rating sites are basically one of the first things that people check out before they even bother to watch a movie or a show. And even though the websites' reputations have been on a large decline, most average people still refer to them as the most reliable source of information. But because it's the internet, major companies now have the ability to manipulate the ratings and critics however they want. Therefore, if you take a look at Rotten Tomatoes, if you have the most critics in the bag, half the job is done. But how do we approach the second part, which is much harder to bribe? The audience. Well, nothing, and I mean nothing, could popularize your piece of content better than social media exposure. Getting a bunch of active millennials or Gen Zers constantly screaming about your new project, for better or worse. And fortunately or unfortunately, nothing, and I mean nothing, gets Western society's attention as quickly, as powerfully, and as passionately as political agendas. I've talked about this in great lengths in my feminist Hollywood video, but basically the summary is that usage of minorities and feminism almost always guarantees some sort of armor for piece of media coming out today. Of course, this is not always the case, but it's a fair try. It will maximize the amount of people who will blindly defend it because it happens to feed into their illusion of what political correctness looks like, and it will minimize the odds of people who dislike it ever publicly speaking out of its faultiness, since any legitimate criticism they have would only be reduced to those people being labeled as simple adjectives. For example, if you don't like Rey, you're a misogynist. You dislike She-Hulk, you're an incel. You don't like Black Panther, you're a racist. You don't like the new Little Mermaid, you are again a racist. This exact argument can be made about 99% of the media released today, because it fits into Hollywood's newborn interest to upkeep the appearances of inclusivity so that the thing sells better by Twitter's stamp of approval and by maximizing the audience score using Western society's ever-growing phobia of being perceived as sexist, racist, or homophobic. And by far the worst thing about this is the people who are hired to create that content, since that only means that they're either aware of the type of garbage they're creating and are doing it only for the paycheck, or they really do believe that their Twitter-attained political worldview that is only limited to LA is gonna actually make a difference. So what happened here?
He'll be rewarded for never maturing, for never understanding or learning that every day can't be about him. There's other people, you selfish asshole.
The Storytellers. That's what happened. George Lucas sold Star Wars to Disney in 2012, and it was a decision of an old man who had exhausted all of his abilities and just wanted some peace and quiet. But back in 1977 though, when Star Wars started to gain an indescribable amount of attention from the general public and started making the studio a lot of money, heads of the 20th Century Fox, like the good businessmen they were, started to fear the worst. That George Lucas would come in and demand a big fat paycheck. But shockingly, Lucas at the time refused to ask for money and only asked for the sequel rights in order to continue his job without involving corporations. And that's the difference between a businessman and a storyteller. One only ever cares for paychecks, while the second one lives for the ability to continue telling the stories, if he wants to. But how is it that back in the 20th century, some unknown up-and-coming film enthusiasts looked at almost non-existent technologies of their time and let that inspire them to create art out of nothing, basically? The same art that enriches modern companies today. And how is it that more technology is now available in the pockets of every walking filmmaker than it was to those guys back in the day, but the mainstream movies have rarely been less creatively exhausted? It's important to note that that era of filmmaking was started by the event in the late 20th century, when the major studios started to search within the film schools for the exact opposite of what they were. New filmmakers who primarily were driven by their passion for film rather than money. And just like that, the new Hollywood was born. That's an actual term, you can Google it. Even though the industry heads were just as financially motivated as they are today, the only distinction that makes the biggest difference is that back then, corporations were under the illusion that the more worthy the piece of art was, the more profitable it would prove to be. After some time, all these businessmen realized that valuable and sellable are not synonyms in this context. Therefore, they started to hire a bunch of filmmakers that are qualified at making marketable and sellable content more than creating art. But it's not only the industry that has changed their HR game, but the filmmakers themselves have changed their approach to the artistry with time. Looking at people like Jon Favreau, J.J. Abrams, and newly Taika Waititi or Patty Jenkins, the list goes on and on. You get a narrative where all of these filmmakers started off as very much promising, likable, and seemingly passionate artists and storytellers, but with time they started to morph into corporate jokes, just abysmal levels of shamelessness. You could say, well, it's the studio who's the actual villain. They limit the filmmakers and don't give them any creative license, but that's not a new problem whatsoever. There's a reason why George Lucas wanted to break off any ties to Hollywood in late 70s. The biggest difference is between the filmmakers themselves. The problem is in the fact that today almost no quote-unquote storyteller would refuse Disney a big chunk of money just what? To keep their artistic integrity? Come on. And that, unfortunately, applies to the filmmakers straight from the new Hollywood era. Before the 70s, the filmmakers were the heads of the film industry, who then hired fellow filmmakers to create movies. During the new Hollywood period, there were now businessmen heading major film companies who still hired aspiring filmmakers to create them movies. Today, though, dare I say it, there are still businessmen heading the studios that are now hiring fellow businessmen to create films. You cannot convince me that Disney rehired J.J. Abrams for episode 9 because of his impeccable ability to create satisfying finales. These types of directors in Hollywood are valued only based on their great ability to shoot some pretty pictures that would look good in the trailers so that the movie sells better. They understand the industry better than they understand storytelling. But they always deliver a good chunk of box office since they work very harmoniously with the studios they were hired by, since they are just as corporate and money-driven as any other studio executive. A storyteller that starts to care for the paycheck more than their ability to tell great stories is no longer a storyteller.
Bye.
Martin Scorsese, one of the best filmmakers of our time and pioneers of the new Hollywood, gave this speech during the New York Film Festival in 2022. He made a point that today, because of the numbers, statistics, and box office, cinema has been turned into a competitive sport. But it's not the competition that artistically bankrupted cinema. To once again go back to Lucas, according to him, in the time before competition of numbers, there was a competition of who is going to create a better movie, who is going to tell the best story in the most creative way, who is going to do the next big thing. Back in the day, for the filmmaker at the scene, the most important thing was not the studio approval, not the opening box office. To them, the most important thing was to create stories by such means of storytelling that it would deserve another storyteller's praise and approval. While before the filmmakers were driven by the love of film, nowadays it's just a game of numbers. The downfall of the cinema is hidden within the fact that a well-deserved emotionally driven feedback from the public has been overshadowed by the opening weekends. Artists and their artistic visions have been overruled by ones and zeros, and moral lessons have been replaced by performative politics. But
Maybe I'll grow out of it.